Snorri Sturluson was one of the most famous men of medieval Iceland. He was born in 1179 into a powerful family called the Sturlungs. From a young age, he was surrounded by both stories and politics, two things that would shape his entire life. He grew up in a time when Iceland was not ruled by a king but by many chieftains, each competing for power and wealth. These leaders often fought against each other, and alliances could shift quickly. Snorri was destined to be part of this world, but he was also unusual because of his love of poetry, history, and stories. Today, he is remembered far more as a writer than as a politician, but in his own time, he tried to be both. His death in 1241 was the result of politics and betrayal, but his writings gave him a legacy that lasted much longer than the power of the men who killed him. As a child, Snorri was fostered at Odin, the home of Jon Loftsson. This was a common practice in Iceland, as fostering created bonds between families and helped spread influence. Odin was also known as a center of learning. Jon Loftsson was a wise and powerful man, and in his household, Snorri was taught poetry, law, and the traditions of his people. This early education made Snorri stand out. He was not only clever with words, but also quick to learn about politics and leadership. This mixture of learning and ambition prepared him for the double life he would later live, as both a chieftain and a poet. As a young man, Snorri became wealthy through marriage and inheritance. His money gave him power, and his knowledge of law and poetry gave him influence. He became law speaker at the Alþingi, Iceland's national assembly. The law speaker was one of the most important figures in Iceland, because at that time the laws were not written down. They were remembered and spoken aloud at the assembly each summer. The law speaker had to memorize the laws and recite them so that everyone knew the rules of the land. Holding this position brought Snorri respect, but it also made him an important political figure who could sway decisions and build alliances. Snorri was also a poet. In medieval Scandinavia, poets were not seen as entertainers, but as men of honor who could praise kings and heroes in verse. Their words were powerful, and rulers often gave them gifts and positions in return for their services. Snorri used his poetry to connect with the royal courts of Norway. This was important because the kings of Norway had growing influence in Iceland and were looking for ways to bring the island under their control. For Snorri, winning the friendship of Norwegian rulers could strengthen his position at home. In 1218, Snorri traveled to Norway for the first time. There he met King Håkon Thor, who was still young, and the king's regent, Skuli Jarl, a powerful nobleman who acted as the real ruler in the king's early years. Snorri was welcomed into their court, wrote poetry in their honor, and was even made a member of the king's retinue. This was a high status for an Icelander and showed that Snorri had succeeded in making himself valuable to the Norwegian crown. However, his close friendship with Skuli Jarl would later cause problems because Skuli and the king were not destined to remain allies forever. When Snorri returned to Iceland in 1220, he brought with him the authority of having royal backing. This made him stronger among the Icelandic chieftains, but it also made him a target. Many of his rivals saw him as too close to Norway and worried that he would use foreign influence to increase his power at home. At the same time, Iceland was sliding deeper into internal conflicts. The Sturlungar family, to which Snorri belonged, was often at the center of battles and feuds with other clans. Some of these feuds turned into outright wars. Snorri tried to play a careful game, making alliances where he could and avoiding direct fights when possible. But his caution was sometimes seen as untrustworthy behavior. Snorri's relationship with Norway remained important. In 1237, he returned there again. By this time, King Håkon Thor was stronger and more confident, while Skuli Jarl had grown restless. Skuli no longer wanted to serve as second to the king and began plotting rebellion. Snorri seemed to take Skúli's side, or at least to sympathize with him. This was dangerous, because when Skúli rose up against King Hákon in 1240, the rebellion failed and Skúli was killed. Snorri suddenly found himself linked with a traitor. King Hákon did not trust Snorri after this. He gave a clear order. Snorri was not allowed to return to Iceland without the king's permission. This command was both a punishment and a way of keeping him under control. Snorri, however, did not obey. In 1239, he sailed back to Iceland without the king's leave. This act made him an enemy in the eyes of the Norwegian crown. The king now wanted him gone, and there were Icelandic chieftains who were ready to carry out the king's will. The man chosen to move against Snorri was Gissur Thorvaldsson, another powerful chieftain in Iceland who was loyal to King Hákon. In 1241, Gissur gathered men and rode to Snorri's estate at Reykholt. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. Snorri had little chance to defend himself. He tried to hide in the cellar, but the attackers found him there. According to tradition, when they discovered him, he said, "Eigi skal högva," which means, "do not strike." Some say this was an attempt to stop the violence. Others say it was a command to spare him, but it made no difference. The men killed him where he stood. Snorri was 62 years old when he died. His death was part of the violent world of Icelandic politics at the time. Chieftains often killed rivals, and betrayal was common. Yet the death of Snorri was shocking because he was not just another political leader. He was also the most talented writer and poet of his age. By murdering him, Iceland lost not only a chieftain, but also a man who had preserved its stories and history. His killers gained favor with the Norwegian king, but in the long run, they are remembered mainly for their role in ending Snorri's life, not for their own deeds. Snorri's real legacy was not in politics, but in his writings. Among his works, the Prose Edda is perhaps the most famous. It was written as a manual for poets, teaching them how to use old styles of verse, but in doing so it recorded the myths and tales of the Norse gods. Through this book we know about Odin, Thor, Loki, the creation of the world, and Ragnarok, the end of the world. Without the Prose Edda, much of Norse mythology would have been lost forever after the coming of Christianity. Snorri also wrote Heimskringla, a great history of the kings of Norway. This work begins with legendary figures and continues through to the 12th century, combining history, saga, and poetry into a sweeping story of kings and battles. Another saga often linked to Snorri is Egil's saga, the tale of Egil Skallagrimsson, a warrior and poet. Whether or not he wrote it, many believe it shows his hand. These writings proved stronger than swords or politics. The kings Snorri praised, the chieftains who fought him, even King Hákon, who ordered his death. All of them are long gone, but the stories Snorri wrote down still live. They have been copied, translated, and read across centuries. They have influenced poets, novelists, and artists from medieval times to the present day. Even in popular culture today, from fantasy novels to films and games, echoes of Snorri's work appear whenever the Norse gods are mentioned. The irony of Snorri's life is that as a politician he failed, but as a writer he triumphed. He tried to rise as a chieftain in Iceland, to use his connections in Norway, and to balance alliances among rival families, but in the end, he was betrayed and killed. His political career ended in blood, and his power vanished with his death. But the words he set down on parchment gave him a kind of immortality. His works are why we remember him, not his political maneuvers. The men who struck him down at Reykholt thought they had silenced him, but in fact, they had not. His voice has carried across 8 centuries, far louder than theirs. In the end, the The story of Snorri Sturluson is one of both tragedy and triumph. Tragedy, because he was caught in the brutal struggles of his time and met a violent death at the hands of his enemies. Triumph, because his writings outlasted them all and preserved for the world the myths and histories of the North. He showed that words can endure longer than power, and that stories can give life to a man long after his body has been buried. Snorri's death in 1241 was the end of his life, but it was not the end of his influence. His legacy lives wherever the tales of Odin and Thor are told, wherever the sagas of kings and poets are read, and wherever people marvel at the survival of Old Norse myth. His words, indeed, outlasted kings,